3513 today, that's correct. I guess we don't have the screen or any of that business today.
You know how it works?
No, I don't.
But we can read from our phone.
What's that?
I can read from our phone.
Right.
I think we're on 12 today.
What's that?
On text 12. Text 12.
Is it text 12 or text 13?
We did 12.
We did 11.
Yeah, I know that there was a verse got skipped somewhere along the line or something like that. At least not the part where they had it. I was 13, I believe it is. What verse did you do yesterday? 11?
Yeah, I believe so.
Actually, yesterday we only did 11, but we're one verse behind. So yesterday also Natava Gauranga Prabhu was suggesting that Ramora Prabhu reads 11 and 12, but he actually only read 11. So I was thinking maybe today if you'd like to read 12 and 13, that would be good. If you'd like to read 12 and 13 and then speak on 13.
Okay. The verse 12 and 13 are actually related. I looked at them both. And I may stumble through the Sanskrit on 12 because I didn't look at it prior. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Agyanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshuramitam Yena Tat Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupaka Dhammayam Dadati Swapadantika Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakalam Shri Guru Vaishnavam Sja Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vikantam Sajivam Sarvaitam Savahunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Deva Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitam Hey Krishna Karuna Sindham Dinabandho Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namokute Tapta Kamshana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhan Sute Devi Pranamami Hare Vanchakopataruyascha Kriva Sindhuriya Evacha Patitam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaur Bhakti Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare Rama Rama Hare Okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll read through the verse of the Lord in his great work of Mahabharata. But the whole idea is to draw attention of the mass of people to Krishna Katha Bhagavad Gita through their strong affinity for hearing mundane topics. So I say, oh, repeat. Your friend and the great sage Krishna Vaipana Vyas
Your friend, the great sage Krishna Vaipana
has already described the transcendental qualities
have already described the transcendental qualities
of the Lord
of the Lord
in his great work of Mahabharata. But the whole idea is to draw the attention of the mass of people to Krishna Katha, Bhagavad Gita, through their strong affinity for hearing mundane topics. Yeah. This is way off. Better than what I said. Okay, so the purport Prabhupada gives us. The great sage, Krishna Vaipana Vyasa, is the author of all major literature, which works Vedanta Sutra, Srimad Bhagavatam, and Mahabharata are very popular readings. As stated in Bhagavatam 1.4.25, Srila Vyasadeva compiled the Mahabharata for the less intelligent class of men who take more interest in mundane topics than in the philosophy of life. The Vedanta Sutra was compiled for persons already above the mundane topics, who might already have tasted the bitterness of the so-called happiness of mundane affairs. The first aphorism of Vedanta Sutra is a tato brahma jigyasa. That is, only when one has finished the business of mundane inquiries in the marketplace of sense gratification can one make relevant inquiries regarding Brahman, the transcendence. Those persons who are busy with mundane inquiries, which fill the newspapers and other such literatures, are classified as Stri Shudra Dvija Bandhus, or women, laborer class, and unworthy sons of the higher classes, Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas. Such less intelligent men cannot understand the purpose of Vedanta Sutra, although they may make a show of studying the sutras in a perverted way. The real purpose of Vedanta Sutra is explained by the author himself in the Srimad Bhagavatam, and anyone trying to understand Vedanta Sutra without reference to Srimad Bhagavatam is certainly misguided. Such misguided persons who are interested in the mundane affairs of philanthropic and altruistic work, under the misconception of the body as a self, could better take advantage of the Mahabharata, which was specifically compiled by Srila Vyasadeva for their benefit. The great author has compiled Mahabharata in such a way that the less intelligent class of men who are more interested in mundane topics may read the Mahabharata with great relish, and in the course of such mundane happiness can also take advantage of the Bhagavad Gita, the preliminary study of Srimad Bhagavatam, or the Vedanta Sutra. Srila Vyasadeva had no interest in writing a history of mundane activities other than to give the less intelligent persons a chance for transcendental realization through Bhagavad Gita. Vidura's reference to the Mahabharata indicates that he had heard of the Mahabharata from Vyasadeva, his real father, while he was away from home and was touring the places of pilgrimage. So I'll switch over to the next verse. Sashadadanasya vivardamana Sashadadhanasya vivardhamana Viraktim anyatra karoti pumsaha.
Viraktim anyatra karoti pumsaha.
Viraktim anyatra karoti pumsaha.
Viraktim pumsaha.
Hare padanusmriti nivritasya. Hare padanusmriti nivritasya. Samasta dukhyapyayam asudate. Samasta dukhyapyayam asudate. Sashaddanasya vivardhamana. Viraktim anyatra karoti pumsaha. Hare padanusmriti nirvritasya. Samasta dukhyapyayam asudate. Sashradhanasya vivardhamana.
Viraktimanyatra karoti pumsaha.
Viraktimanyatra karoti pumsaha.
Hare padanusmriti nirvritasya.
Hare padanusmriti nirvritasya.
Samasta dukhyapyayam asudate.
Samasta dukhyapyayam asudate. Sashradhanasya vivardhamana. Viraktim anyatra karoti pumsaha. Hare padanusmriti nirvritasya. Samasta dukhyapyayam asudate. Ladies. Sashradhanasya vivardhamana. Viraktimanyatra karoti pumsaha. Hare padanusmriti nirvritasya. Samasta dukhyapyayam asudate. The translation reads, for one who is anxious to engage constantly in hearing such topics, Krishna Katha gradually increases his indifference to all other things. Such constant remembrance of the lotus feet of Lord Krishna by the devotee who has achieved transcendental bliss vanquishes all his miseries without delay. So I say, and you all please repeat again. For one who is anxious to engage, constantly in hearing such topics, Krishna Katha gradually increases his indifference towards all other things. Such constant remembrance of the lotus feet of Lord Krishna by the devotee who has achieved transcendental bliss vanquishes all miseries without delay. So here we have the purport to this verse, 3.5.13. We must certainly know that on the absolute plane, Krishna Katha and Krishna are one and the same. The Lord is the absolute truth, and therefore his name, form, qualities, etc., which are all understood to be Krishna Katha, are non-different from him. Bhagavad Gita, being spoken by the Lord, is as good as the Lord himself. When a sincere devotee reads Bhagavad Gita, this is as good as seeing the Lord face to face in his personal presence. But this is not so for the mundane wrangler All the potencies of the Lord are there when one reads Bhagavad Gita, provided it is read in the way recommended in the Gita by the Lord himself. One cannot foolishly manufacture an interpretation of Bhagavad Gita and still bring about transcendental benefit. Anyone who tries to squeeze some artificial meaning or interpretation from the Bhagavad Gita for an ulterior motive is not shradhana pumsaha, one engaged anxiously in the bona fide hearing of Krishna Katha. Such a person cannot derive any benefit from reading Bhagavad Gita, however great a scholar he may be in the estimation of a layman. The shraddhadhana, or faithful devotee, can actually derive all the benefits of Bhagavad Gita, because by omnipotency of the Lord, he achieves the transcendental bliss which vanquishes attachment and nullifies all concomitant material miseries. Only the devotee, by his factual experience, can understand the import of this verse spoken by Vidura. The pure devotee of the Lord enjoys life by constantly remembering the lotus feet of the Lord, by hearing Krishna Katha. For such a devotee, there is no such thing as material existence. And the much advertised bliss of Brahmananda is like a fig for the devotee who is in the midst of the transcendental ocean of bliss. So I'll reread these verses. Your friend, the great sage Krishna Dvaipana Vyas, has already described the transcendental qualities of the Lord in his great work, the Mahabharata. But the whole idea is to draw attention of the mass of people to Krishna Katha, Bhagavad Gita, through their strong affinity for hearing mundane topics. For one who is anxious to engage constantly in hearing such topics, Krishna Katha gradually increases his indifference towards all other things. Such constant remembrance of the lotus feet of Lord Krishna by the devotee who has achieved transcendental bliss vanquishes all his miseries without delay. So I thought I'd start by just asking if any of the devotees here have any questions about this section that we've been going through. Any questions that were rolling around there and haven't gotten brought up or verbalized or whatever it is. Yeah. Do we have a microphone? I guess not. Yeah.
I was just from yesterday's class I had a question about like we hear about hair, it destroys our material desires. So like how does hearing and then after hearing and chanting, how do they work together? Because sometimes like you might want to chant and you don't have a taste for hearing. So how does hearing affect your chanting?
Uh-huh. So you're saying, how does hearing eventually improve your chanting of the japa, or just?
Yeah, chanting or kirtan or even japa also.
How does hearing gradually awaken? You're saying a deeper Krishna consciousness is?
What's the importance of like hearing?
Say it again?
What's the importance of like
Hearing.
hearing?
Yeah, okay, good. Because I was actually planning to kind of speak about that overall concept. I'll see if I'm answering your question, and later you can tell me whether it's an appropriate response, because sometimes it's hard to get the sense of the essence of the question. So this is a theme in both of these verses, 3.5.11 and 3.5.12 and 3.5.13 is this idea of Krishna Katha. And Krishna Katha, by hearing about Krishna, one can become purified and become very lost in wanting to hear more and more. A couple of days ago, I think it was, or maybe it was 3 days ago, Pancharatra gave class and he talked about that. I looked at that class on YouTube, and he was describing it very nicely, that, when we become enraptured in hearing about Krishna's pastimes, we become lost. And that is the mark of a very high devotee. And then he mentioned that, he personally doesn't feel that kind of deep connection. And I have to admit, I don't either. It's an interesting point. And I was happy that this point came up, because I think it's something we all need to focus in on in an important way. I think my foot's going to sleep. The issue is that just to hear the pastimes of Krishna would actually purify the consciousness and bring one to the highest level, just hearing, However, there's some fine print there, We hear that there are 9 processes of devotional service. Anybody can list them? What's next? Bandhanam, yeah. Yeah. Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smarnam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Bandhanam, Dasyam, Sakyam, Atmini, Videnam, Iti Pum Sarpita, Vishnu, Bhaktas, Chandavalakshana, Kriyeti, Bhagavati, Adha, Tanmanye, Dihitam, Uttamam. So these are 9 processes of devotional service. And it mentions in the purport, Prabhupada says, that all of them, or any one of them, could deliver the living entity from mundane consciousness. All of them, or any one of them. And then we have another verse somewhere where it describes an individual devotees who all became perfected by engaging in one particular of these 9 processes of devotional service, one particular type. Yet, we see Prabhupada and Bhaktisiddhanta and others in our disciplic line never really encourage this kind of mono-focus on a particular branch of these 9 processes. Rather, we kind of have a kind of moving from one process to the other, We don't just chant japa. We don't just offer prayers. We don't just listen to Bhagavatam class. We don't just recite shlokas. We don't just do service, but rather we do all these things. And the reason is that our minds would not be purified enough to be able, in general, to just cling to one type of devotional service, just one type, and be able to kind of make a go of it and go back home, back to Godhead. That's why Prabhupada never encouraged anybody. And sometimes devotees did suggest that they would go chant in a secluded place. Prabhupada never encouraged it. Bhaktisiddhanta was very against that too, and he wrote a poem called Dushtamana, my dear wicked mind, you think you could chant in a secluded place. Of course, actually Bhaktisiddhanta even did that at one point in his life. He had a bhajan kutir and he chanted 1 billion names of God, and it took him, I forget, a long time to do it, But not because the way our minds are, and we're caught in so many material desires and material ways and patterns, that simply one form of devotional service probably won't do it for us. We need the whole thali. We can't just have the sabji, we have to have the whole thali. We have to have all the different things. And elsewhere, Prabhupada describes what we know as the Pancharatra System. So this is described earlier in the Bhagavatam. We have the Pancharatra System, and we have what's called Bhagavata Marg, or Bhagavati Vidhi, sometimes it's called that. So Bhagavata Marg is just wholesale devotional service, immersing yourself in chanting, But Bhagavata Marg by itself, we usually can't make a go of it. We have to include the Pancharatrika System. And what is the Pancharatrika System? Well, if you read Pancharatra, you'll discover that it describes, the brahmachari gets up in the morning and he cleanses his body and he puts on fresh clothes. Then he makes a sound when he comes into the temple room. And suddenly things start sounding very familiar, that we don't see devotees just performing mono service of one particular type. Not to say that it couldn't work, but generally it doesn't, and it's not recommended by the acharyas. Rather, we kind of flip from one thing to another. We have waking up in the morning, we're doing basic service, purifying our bodies, doing our various putting of tilak, etc., etc. Then we have Mangal Artik, and then after Mangal Artik, we worship Tulsi to help counteract our offenses. Then after that, we engage in japa, and then we have class, and eventually have prasadam. Then we have practical service. And this is the Pancharatrika system, that you have all these different things, because the mind can be captured by this sort of smorgasbord or plenum of different type of devotional activity. When we have many different types, the mind is not brutalized by trying to hone in on just one thing, because that's generally not the way we work, and that's generally not the path that we've all come from. So this is why we have what's known as Sadhana Bhakti. So Sadhana Bhakti means we perform the Pancharatrika Vidhi, or the Pancharatrika Marg. We perform this group of activities which are supportive of Bhagavata Marg. So because we perform these other things, coming to Mangal Artik, performing menial service, hearing Bhagavatam class, etc., etc., when we chant our japa, the cumulative effect of doing these other things means our japa becomes more and more fine-tuned. We may even go on for years. I certainly did, kind of mumbling your japa and doing it, falling asleep most of the time through a big portion of it. And then one day you're sitting in a class and you realize, hey, this japa is actually what the whole thing's about. And I'm just squandering my focus on japa. I'm not really doing, one day it just hits you, and you make an effort to do better japa, and you do better japa, and it lasts for 2 months, and then you realize you're slacking off again. So, this is the constant battle that will happen. But because we're becoming purified, and because we understand the key and center focus of the process of japa, we will perfect japa, but we need these other things. We need deity worship. We need eating prasadam. We need eating certain kinds of prasadam. We need practical service. We need a schedule that keeps us kind of in the mode of goodness. And these are all elements of the Pancharatrika system. So in first canto, Prabhupada in the purports talks about this. Now this is 2 rails of a train, The Bhagavata Marg could, on its own, purify us. And it is what generally we hear when we hear about Vaishnava theology. But the Pancharatrika system is what makes Bhagavata Marg practicable, And one day we will come to the point where we could actually listen to Krishna book or the activities of Krishna. We could listen to it for hours and hours and we would never become satiated. Like Vidura. Many of us are not at that stage. I'm certainly not. And this is why I was interested, when Pancharatna, we got Pancharatna and Pancharatra. So the Pancharatra is the system, and Pancharatna is our devotee. So Pancharatna mentioned, that Prabhupada had a devotee read from Krishna book, and after reading one chapter, everybody was zoning, and then after the second chapter, everybody was really like, whoa, and then after the third chapter. This is kind of what happens to the mind when it's not fully purified. Now, I'm going to get into controversial territory. Boom, 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 boom. There are those, and you will meet them, who will tell you that hearing Krishna Katha is the whole essence of everything. And let them go for it, if they can do it. But we see that this has not been the approach of our past acharyas. Prabhupada certainly didn't just sit down and have hours and hours where he would speak about the intimate dealings of Radha and Krishna. It is Krishna Katha. And were we purified enough, we would be able to appreciate that. Not just for hours on end, we could sit for days. Vidura's at that stage. We're not. So this is a very attractive kind of philosophy. Why do we need to cut vegetables or go out on Sankirtan or talk to people who are disturbing when we try to get them to appreciate Prabhupada's books or accept them? Why do we need to do all that? We could just hear about Radha and Krishna all day. And the answer is, yes, you could. It is possible. But are you at the level where you could just be absorbed in that? Because if you're not absorbed in it, then what you're going to be doing is thinking about something else while all this is going on. So Vidura, we hear that Vidura started by asking more basic questions. That's one of the themes of this chapter. He started by asking basic questions. And then later on, what he really wanted to do was hear about Krishna, and he knew that Maitreya could speak about Krishna. But we see that Maitreya doesn't do that. What he actually starts to do is explain about creation, from verse 1 to 16. We're at 13 right now. So at 16, that section ends, and then we have Maitreya explaining how creation takes place. And that goes from 17 to 28, and from 29 to 51, the whole third section of this chapter, chapter 5 of Canto 3. That section is all about demigods, making various prayers, So we're not hearing about Krishna. We're hearing about Krishna's material potency and the process of devotional service, which is identical to hearing about Krishna. And for us, in many cases, that's preferable and much more appropriate to our level of understanding, and it can capture us, and therefore we make progress in that way from that. And so hearing and chanting about Krishna is important. Chanting japa is important. But because of our lack of purity, we need other engagements sprinkled in there to be able to fully and appropriately take shelter of those forms of devotional service. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other question? Yes.
Is it true that when Prabhupada came first to us, he wanted to give just...
Can you speak into the mic for the benefit of others?
When Prabhupada came, is it true that when Prabhupada came to US, he wanted to give the best, just the Bhagavad process to the people here, so that he just wanted them to chant and do 64 rounds, and he didn't want to give them Parajamana, because if you're just following Bhagavad, you don't need all this kind of thing.
So let me see if I can paraphrase your question, if I understood it correctly. You're saying when Prabhupada first came, was it true that he had planned just to have people chant and that was all he was going to do? Is that?
Just follow the Bhagavad Gita process.
And follow what?
The Bhagavad,
Bhagavad Marg. Yeah, yeah. Actually, I was thinking something like that too, but I hesitated to talk about it because I couldn't remember for sure whether it was like that. There was a time, actually you all might be surprised, there was a time when devotional service, there were no deities, there was no kirtan the way we do it today with mridangas and kartals and harmonium and such. There was no regular activity throughout the day. There was prasadam. But there were no temples as we know them today. You can imagine that when Prabhupada first came here, how different that was. And gradually Prabhupada introduced deities, he introduced worshiping the deities by dressing them. He gradually introduced all these things. And I think this is a good indication that, you know, it could have been just because it was impossible to introduce all these things right away. You know, it would take time, you know. There was a time before he even had a mridanga, you know. Finally, he used to use this bongo, you know, and then eventually he had a mridanga sent from India. And it was, you know, the first time he led a kirtan with a mridanga as opposed to a bongo, you know. So at any rate, it just shows how this works out. And what's interesting is it wasn't just Prabhupada, you know, but if we go and we study Bhakti Siddhanta, if you try to find classes where Bhakti Siddhanta is talking about the intimate pastimes of Radha and Krishna, you won't find them. He's talking about philosophy. Prabhupada talked about philosophy. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, most of his writings, don't talk about the intimate pastimes of Radha and Krishna. Of course, Prabhupada gave us the Krishna book. That's intimate pastimes. But it's just kind of, it's not the main course. It's not what we spend all of our time focusing on. We need something to, we need, as the Bhagavatam does, there are 9 full cantos explaining the energies of Krishna and what God actually is before we hear about what he does, you know, in 10th canto, where the little baby and he sucks out the life of Putana and he has these relationships with the gopis, et cetera, et cetera. So this is intentional, that we have to reach a level of purification before we can really take advantage of these higher things. And I think I want to do more research into that, but somehow I remember something like that too. But I'm not going to say that it's a veridical fact at this point, because I don't know. I'd have to look a little bit at that, you know. So one of the things I also wanted to mention is that in his book, Unveiling His Lotus Feet, which is Burijan's book. If you've never seen it, looks like this. There's a show and tell here. And this is not the full Srimad Bhagavatam. It's from cantos 1 to canto 4. That's what it is. And it's Burijan's kind of breakdown of Srimad Bhagavatam. He also, of course, does this with Bhagavad Gita in his Surrender Unto Me. So oftentimes, it's very good to get a book like this and kind of see how the whole thing ties together. And he makes points that normally you might not pick up on. For instance, he makes the point, why did Prabhupada, or why does it say that Vidura didn't start with asking just to hear Krishna Katha? Why didn't he do that? And he mentions that there were 2 reasons. And Prabhupada points out one of the reasons was that Vidura was humble. He didn't start off with just asking intimate, wanting to hear about the intimate pastimes of Krishna. And this is another thing that we might focus in on, that generally speaking, we hear pastimes of Krishna. I mean, the Krishna book is pastimes of Krishna, and it's the 10th canto. But it's not all we hear. And we can listen to it, but we also need to hear Bhagavatam. So Bhagavatam gives us the remembrance that Krishna is not just some boy kicking around, 5,000 years ago doing some wild stuff. He's the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And he's got this material world, which is like a virtual reality. And he's creating a world here, and he's running many other material universes just like this one. And beyond it all, there's a spiritual world. He's running that too. And he's got pastimes going on in the spiritual world. He's got pastimes going on in this world. And it's all really so that he can enjoy and have relationships with his parts and parcels, you and I, all of us. But we came here because we didn't want to participate in the pastimes in the spiritual world. So we are also exercising our negative pastimes of trying to enjoy the material world without Krishna. So we're also doing that. And eventually we try to reverse that trend. So he didn't immediately want to hear about Krishna because he was humble. He didn't want to be presumptuous. And secondly, he was also bereft of Krishna's association just recently. So Krishna had just left the planet. And it's kind of like he didn't know what he was going to get into if he started listening about Krishna. Would he go into ecstasy? Would he be plunged into separation? What would happen to Maitreya? Would the whole interchange end? Because Maitreya might go into ecstasy, so all these kind of things. So these were the two reasons that Gurujan focuses on in his unveiling his lotus feet. I thought I'd bring that out. So the word that Prabhupada focuses on in the second verse that we read, verse 12, or 13 rather, was this Shradadhana Pumsam, which means someone who is ardently listening to Krishna Katha. So, Shradadhanasya, so one who is anxious to hear. So if we're anxious to hear and we're anxious to apply, then Krishna consciousness will go smoothly for us. And we really do have to learn the philosophy. We didn't grow up in the backwoods in a small village in Bengal somewhere. We grew up in America, in the Western modern world. We were taught to think critically. We were taught to examine things with logic and reason. And unless we use that logic and reason and apply it to our understanding of Krishna consciousness, there will come a time where it will lead us away from Krishna consciousness, because we need to understand why we're doing things. We can think, oh, Krishna is so wonderful, and the color of his feet, and this and that and the other. But as the years press on, we will encounter all kinds of obstacles in our devotional life. Plus, we are going to encounter, all of you will encounter, bogus presentations of the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. Philosophical presentations that seem on the surface like Krishna consciousness, but are actually a wolf in sheep's clothing. And if you take part in them, then at some point you'll realize we're somewhere far away doing something not really that Krishna conscious. But still, not to worry. Even if that does happen, all you have to do is dust yourself off and walk back the right direction. And sometimes that's the only way to learn. And you learn by doing the wrong thing. And then you suddenly realize that the bliss of Krishna consciousness has gotten cut off. And you're doing things you don't know why you're doing them. And you're confused and everything seems upside down. It's a sure sign that you have embraced something which on the surface looks like Krishna consciousness, but deeply within, there's something not right about it. And so this is why we have to make an effort to understand the philosophy, understand what's important, especially what's more important and what's less important. Because throughout Krishna consciousness, there are many imperatives, many commands that were given by our literatures that we should do or should be like, etc., etc. We will never be able to do them all. However, we better do the most important ones. If we don't, we're going to gradually sink, And sometimes, and this is usually what happens, is that we substitute for some big thing that we should definitely be focused on. We substitute something which is not really that important. And we think because we're able to do that really not important thing very, very well, very, very carefully, very, very appropriately, that this is good as doing the more important thing. Whereas it's much better to do the more important thing, even with faults, than it is to do a less important thing completely perfectly. So these things will be there, and that's why I'm mentioning them. And it's important to realize them. So we have to do the whole process of Krishna consciousness, particularly hearing and chanting, not just Krishna's intimate pastimes. Sometimes we may actually even get a little bit of a basya and relish them to some extent in them. And we may find other people who are able to relish them at some deeper level, and that's fine for them. But for us, we need to understand who Krishna is, and we need to understand the philosophy of how to purify ourselves, because otherwise, tendency to just imagine more advanced really is quite strong. Okay. So, any other questions? We're at the hour here, so we'll see if everybody has anything. Yes.
Basically, we need this variety because our minds need variety. We need variety of what is that, different types of devotional service because our minds are no longer opportunity to do one thing.
Yeah, are you asking if that's a good summary? Yeah, that's what I would say. Basically, that's kind of the way it works. That's why there are 9 processes, devotional service. So we have that verse where we have the devotee who is perfected by each individual service. At the end we have the combination of all of them. We have this idea that we need to be careful and engage in all the different kinds of devotional service, trying to do them each as practically as we possibly can. And then there will be ups and downs, there will be times when we do them better, times when we do them worse. But if we stay with it and we don't make offenses, the process will surely work. And I think, I wish it was different, that God will come. It's already coming under a lot of internal division, over what's important and what's not important. And there's some who are fighting battles about things that are absolutely not important at all. And there are others who are ignoring principles that are absolutely Krishna consciousness. And that's why we really have to dig down and understand what this philosophy is saying, and what's important in the philosophy and what's not, because sometimes when push comes to shove, you have to let go of those things that are not so important and cleave to those things which are paramount and the most important in Krishna consciousness. And if you do that, you'll be all right. Krishna will carry what you lack and preserve what you have. But if it's the other way around, you may drift away. Yeah.
What are the things that are the most important and which are the things that are not so important?
Well, things that are most important are to avoid offenses and to chant Hare Krishna and to try to give Krishna to others. If those are kind of key things in your life, you'll be all right. Some people take vows to read a certain amount of, every day, or they take vows to take only milk during a certain time of year, or they take vows. I mean, all these things can be good. They can help one in devotional service. But the real essence is to try to give Krishna consciousness to others. That's what Krishna appreciates the most. And try to keep yourself pure by remembering that the center of this whole process is the chanting of the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. How well are you doing that, And if you keep that in mind, you'll be okay. And of course, avoiding offenses. Those are, I'd say, the central features of Krishna consciousness. There are more, but at any rate, we'll stop at this point. So I thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.
thought we had the right cables, but it turns out the cables I had.
Yeah. Doing these things, it's always a constant